Hello, and welcome to the Center for Jewish History. I am Leonora Lang, Archival Services Manager and Digital Collections Coordinator here at the Center. I'm here with Andrei Filimonov, an archivist at the Center, and Evan Kingsley, former Executive Director of one of our partner institutions, the American Jewish Historical Society, or AJHS. Andrei and Evan are here to share a story about how Evan reconnected with his bar mitzvah twin, Misha, and how Andrei assisted in that reconnection. So, Evan, tell us a little bit about having a bar mitzvah twin. How did you come to have a twin?
My father, Rabbi Ralph Kingsley, is and was the rabbi of a large congregation in South Florida, a large Reform congregation in South Florida. It was a congregation that was blessed with a number of people who were at a point in their lives when they were eager to be active in a cause or causes, and the Soviet Jewry cause was one that was near and dear to people's hearts. I think in part because some of those folks were people who were born in other countries and came there. I think in part because of fervor over Israel and what we could do, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, not only for Israel but to aid its immigration. Among those congregants were Adele and Joel Sandberg, Margie and Howard Sanford, Bob and Miriam Wolf, all of whom evolved to play prominent roles in the Soviet Jewry movement, not just in South Florida, which I believe had one of the more active conferences or groups, but really on a national level and an international level, such that the Soviet Jewry movement was something that I heard about and was exposed to regularly. I should say in part because those very same families were part of my own family's circle of friends, and in part because it was a prominent part of the congregation's life, and in part because I grew up in a part of South Florida that was heavily Jewish, where the Soviet Jewry movement was something that was spoken about at many congregations and by many people. And so there were rallies that youth group members would attend, and there were rallies that congregants would attend. It's a vivid part of my childhood. So much so that I also recall on at least one particular Sunday, sitting around the living room of one of the couples that I mentioned, one of the families that I mentioned, listening in on a phone call between one of those individuals and a prominent Soviet refusenik, Jewish refusenik, which left an indelible impression on me. At each bar mitzvah at my congregation, and there were many of them, South Florida was exploding with Jewish families who had moved down from New Jersey and New York and so on. And so in the 1970s, by the mid-1970s, on any given Saturday throughout the entire year, there were one or two or sometimes more bar mitzvahs taking place at my father's synagogue. And a prominent feature of the concluding section of each bar mitzvah service was not only the presentation of the Kiddush cup and the Bible or a prayer book, whatever it was that was given, which you knew most of those kids were never going to open, but also a gold star of David, which had the name of a Jewish young man or woman about the same age as we were at the time and to whom we were encouraged to correspond. I still remember being on the bima or sitting in the congregation as other kids were on the bima, and the sound of the crinkle of the plastic as the board member who was presenting the Kiddush cup and the Torah and the Bible and the Jewish star to the bar mitzvah would fumble opening up the Star of David, removing it from the plastic bag, and then perhaps it was my father, perhaps it was the board member, would read out the brief bio of the person who was remembered on the star. And my father would exhort the bar mitzvah to write to that individual, "Do not forget." I actually followed through, and I wrote to the young man who was about my same name. His name was Misha, and lo and behold, Misha wrote back. But not only did he write back, he wrote back memorably, because Misha was an artist, and so included in his letters, which told me about some of the bands that he was familiar with, maybe Led Zeppelin at the time, and a little bit about his life, would also draw a picture in those letters. I remember this as an extended correspondence, but in fact it was probably just a few letters back and forth, but they were memorable letters, and I saved them. After that correspondence ended, I thought about Misha from time to time. I wonder whatever happened to him. Did he emigrate to Israel? Or once I moved to Brooklyn and lived in Park Slope after college, I kind of always thought, well, maybe Misha's living in Coney Island or Brighton Beach, And maybe when I've gone to a Russian restaurant or had frozen vodka on the boardwalk, maybe Misha's been right there. Who knows? And shouldn't I look him up? Mm-hmm. I never did, though.
But then you started as executive director at AJHS in 2008. And at that point, you ended up approaching archivists to do just that. So what made you think of asking them?
Well, when I came to AJHS, I learned that the archive of the American Soviet Jewry movement was a key part of what it was that we were active doing at the time. And in fact, we had several archivists on staff who were responsible for those projects. Among them was Andrei Filmonov, who is a wonderful, wonderful person, a wonderful archivist, and somebody who I connected with right away. And I told Andrei the story. I don't remember if it was in a formal way or just a, hey, I got this story for you. But we got to talking, and I shared that story. And Andrei offered to do a little bit of digging to find out a little bit more. I also had in my head that maybe I still had those letters someplace because, in fact, from my earliest years, I was an amateur archivist. By that I mean I was just always the kind of kid who liked to keep things in good order. And I had file cabinets, and I kept file folders, and I kept stuff. I kept playbills, I kept correspondence. I also kept things like automotive brochures, which I collect to this day. So I looked back in my own personal archives, and I found those letters. Andrei, do you want to pick up from there?
Sure, and it was exactly like you said. You mentioned that you had a bar mitzvah twin, and you told me his name, and I just opened the finding aid for the then recently processed Union of Councils for Soviet Jews records, which contains several thousand case files for refuseniks just like Misha. And I found the case file for his parents, which told me that they eventually did, after years in refusal, they made it out of the Soviet Union and they were living in Haifa. And thus I was able to get in touch with them, and I got in touch with Misha's father, and he told me that Misha now lives in New York and provided me with his phone number, which I supplied to Evan.
Yeah. So that was the amazing thing, right? From Leningrad and North Miami Beach, here we were both making it to New York City, me to Park Slope, and he to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The two places actually are quite similar, and so there was a certain irony in all of that. I could have been living on the Upper West Side. He could have been living in Park Slope. We weren't very far from each other, and I did get in touch. Andrei facilitated that communication, and I got in touch with Misha. We, in fact, had a wonderful reunion. It was an amazing thing. Who would have imagined? Moreover, who would have imagined that I would have ended up in the position that I was in, American Jewish Historical Society, executive director, and Misha, who would have imagined that the guy who drew pictures at 13, 14, or 15 years old to me in his letters ended up as the art director of a major publication in New York City, living not a few miles from where I was living.
It's amazing, yeah. So having this experience, did that change your perspective at all on the value of archives?
Well, as I indicated earlier, archives have always been something that I think were part of my DNA. I'm an organizer, I'm a keeper, and the things that I keep in good order. I was attracted to the position at the American Jewish Historical Society in part because I had a background in libraries. I had worked for a number of years in senior positions at Brooklyn Public Library, but in part because the whole thing made sense to me. I loved what American Jewish Historical Society was all about. I understood the importance of its collections, the importance of archives as the irrefutable fact that no written history can replicate in the way that document can. But historians have access to two types of documents, right? Ones that are, let's say, more formal, that are more official, they're institutional, but then they have those, like these letters, that tell very, very personal stories that complement the ones that the official documents or the institutional documents tell. I'm kind of curious, from Andrei, how do you think people might access that little bit of an archive that I gave to American Jewish Historical Society?
Well, each one of these letters, of which we have thousands at the American Jewish Historical Societies, they're like little pieces of puzzle that together they make up full picture that you won't necessarily see in institutional records. And this is something that people can look at if they are studying the history of the Soviet Jewry movement, the history of Jews in Eastern Europe, the history of Cold War, and I mean, it's just there's many layers to the story and to this piece of mosaic.
Well, I hope that somebody someday accesses those letters and it opens up a window into what it was like to live in the Soviet Union. They can read through the lines of the letters, what was said and then what was not said, and understand something also about how people on two different sides of the world connected at that very interesting moment in world history.
I just also want to add, I wanted to mention a little project. It's actually not a little project, it's a big project that we've accomplished recently. We've digitized all of the trip reports of American Jews that went to the Soviet Union and wrote debriefing after they returned. And it's now digitized, and people are actually already accessing it and analyzing it and looking at it to use it as a sort of basis for their further research into that era, into the phenomenon of the Soviet Jewry movement, into the phenomenon of the Cold War, and basically it's an amazing body of there are several thousand stories of Americans who went into the Cold War era Soviet Union. So.
My father actually was one who took one of those trips, and I remember and know his story, but I also remember that the Sandbergs had taken at least one, if not several, and it didn't go so well, and they had a horrific experience, and that story was relayed as well. Those are the ways, just like these letters, that something that can seem sort of abstract becomes very, very real when you hear how it actually happened, how it actually went down for people, whether it be those who traveled there or those like my pen pal who lived through it.
Thank you so much for sharing your story.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Many thanks to Andrei Filimonov and Evan Kingsley for sharing this story. To learn more about the Center for Jewish History and the American Jewish Historical Society, visit our webpages at cjh.org and ajhs.org.